guys. So whenever I get the same question more than about a half a dozen times, people reaching out to me, I try to do a quick little video just to address it because I know there's a lot of people who watch this. So one of the questions that I keep getting a lot is, how do I invest when I don't have any money? And I'm going to start out here with a huge disclaimer, and I'm probably going to lose half my audience, but that's okay. The reality is, if you're just getting started and you don't have any type of a track record, I'm going to say you should not be using other people's money. So if you're putting money at risk in the beginning and you're still learning, trying to figure out how to do all this stuff, it should be your own money that you're putting at risk. You know, you shouldn't be putting somebody else's money at risk when you don't know what you're doing. So before you do any of this stuff, I'm going to say you need to build yourself a track record, do at least 5 or 6 deals successfully on your own, before you start considering trying to use outside investors. So that being said, I'm going to teach you this is kind of a idea that I got from a guy named Dale Hensel. He's a big time entrepreneur. I actually got to speak with him a couple times, but what he told me is, in the beginning, instead of trying to figure out how can I get the most out of the investor, give away a little bit extra. Do more than what's expected of you. So, if the argument there is, if an investor is going to invest with you and they're only making 8% returns on their money, why would they invest with you when they can go make the same money with a lot less hassle in the stock market, making 8%? So for an investor to be able to justify learning how to do something a little bit different, taking a little bit of a risk on a person, you need to be able to give them returns that are more than they would be able to get, just in the stock market. So give away a little bit extra. What can you do for the investor versus, what can the investor do for you? So when you start thinking that way and, truly and honestly try to help out the people that are investing with you, it'll make a huge difference. They'll tell their friends, and before you know it, people will start throwing money at you. It really does happen. So private lending and equity partner are kind of the two different types of ways to use, like general ways to use private funding. And I'm going to talk through each of them a little bit and when they're applicable and when you should use them. So a private lender is basically, you have an outside investor that is just acting as the bank. And I would say the most common time to use a private lender is if you're doing a house flip. So if you're buying a house, fixing it up, and either refinancing it or selling it off, that is a great way to use a private lender. So a traditional hard money loan, a lot of times they're 15% interest and 5 points. So if you can make 12% for a private lender, you're still saving money versus using a hard money lender, but you're also making them really good returns on their money as well. So it's a win-win situation. Private lending, there's a few different ways to secure that lender. So they can do a secured first. That basically means that there is a promissory note and a deed of trust that secures them against the property. So if you don't do what you say you're going to do, you don't pay them, and you default on your loan, basically they become the owner of the property, just like if a bank was to foreclose on you. There's also a secured second and personal guarantee. So you can use a personal guarantee by itself or in conjunction with either a secured first or a secured second. Now, on a secured second, when would you use that? So that is something you need to be really careful with. So for example, if you purchased a property and you used a private investor to fund the down payment, what that means is you are 100% financed on that property. So that means your loan value is the same as your purchase price. And that is okay in certain circumstances, but you need to be really careful because being 100% leveraged on a property, if the market drops or prices fall, you could find yourself underwater where you owe more on the property than what it's worth. So that's something you need to be really careful with. I'm going to say it is okay to use this in certain circumstances, but only when it's a value add type property. So if you're buying something distressed, you're going to fix it up and either refinance or sell later to where you're generating a lot of equity in that property. Then it's okay to use a secured second. Or So like for example, we had some commercial property that we bought, and we literally bought this property for about 50 or 60 cents on the dollar. So we had a significant amount of equity. So in a situation like that, it's okay to do, but it's something you need to be very careful of. So if you're paying, if you're paying that investor 12% interest, monthly interest only, and your property is only generating, 12% cash on cash return, that basically means your cash flow is going to be break even. So you really need to think about, if this property is not performing properly, am I going to be able to, keep up with the payments? And it's definitely something I would use only under certain circumstances, or else you could get yourself into trouble. So that's private lending. The second way you can use, private funding is as an equity partner, and we've done this on a couple deals. But an equity partner basically means, they are actually a part owner in the property. So for example, we have an apartment building that we're doing right now, and we have an equity partner on that deal. And what we did is we drew up all the LLC documents, and he is actually a part owner in that LLC. So, for example, we purchased this property, also a value add. So I'm going to tell you, if you're using an equity partner, you should always be doing value add properties. So if you use somebody else's money to buy a property, and you basically paid 100% of what it's worth, and say that property is generating 10% cash on cash return. So if the equity splits 50-50, that means that investor is only making 5% on the cash flow, and then obviously he's making the loan paid on other things. But you're not really generating a very good return for your investor. Now, if you take a value add property and you use him as an equity partner to purchase the property, then you rehab it, you get the property performing, and increase the cash flow and the value of that property, then you can justify using an equity partner, because you've built a significant amount of equity in that property, and you can actually generate very good returns for that investor. So when you're doing an equity partner, there's quite a few things that you really need to consider here. So whether that equity partner will be a co-signer on the loan or not. So if they are not signed on to that loan, the limit of their liability is basically whatever their initial investment is. So if they invested $200,000, then the most they could lose is $200,000. If they are a co-signer on that loan and things go really bad, they could potentially lose more, right? So that's something you need to think about. There is benefit to you as the investor of having them as a co-signer on the loan, because, depending on whether you're able to qualify or not, that might be the difference between being able to qualify for a property or not. So I would suggest, if they are a co-signer on the loan, you should probably think about giving them a larger, percentage share ownership, because that's worth something to you. So something else you need to think about is voting or non-voting. So, when you're making decisions as a company, so if you own an LLC and you have an equity partner and maybe other partners in this LLC, everybody has, the regular members have voting rights. So the question is this equity partner going to have voting rights or not? And then depending on his share, how much does his vote count? So if he's a 20% owner in the deal, for example, that means his one vote counts as 20%. So if you have, 4 partners, and each one of them's, let's say 25%, because the math's easier, then his vote is, 1/4 of the vote. So basically, you'd have you could have 2 people vote one way, 2 vote the other way, and you'd have to figure out some way to break the tie. But, so something you need to think about. And then the other thing is, so this is something I've been researching a lot, but SEC regulations, so you do have to be careful with how you go about raising money. So you cannot publicly, if you publicly, let's say I get on Facebook and say I'm looking for, equity partners for this deal, blah, 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 blah. It's almost like you're basically kind of advertising a stock almost. So there's kind of a fine line there between what's okay and what's not okay. I would definitely check with your attorney on what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do there, and make sure you're not violating any SEC regulations. But as long as this equity partner is a member of that LLC, it's not looked at as a security because they are basically, a member of the company. They actually are a part owner of the company. So something you need to be careful of. And then, here's some considerations. So, like I said, I would always be doing value add type properties if you're going to be using private lending. And that's just because honestly, I would always do value add investing. Personally, because you want to create equity, and whenever you create equity in a deal, that's just an extra level of security. So if you can generate 20% equity in a deal plus the market drops 20%, you still can sell the property and get out from under it if you need to. If you pay 100% of the value of a property to purchase it, and the market goes down, then you're underwater and you got yourself in trouble, right? So I would always, make sure you're doing value add type properties. And then risk is obviously something you need to think about. You need to think about risk both for the investor and risk for yourself in each situation. So like I said, in a second lien position, when you have something 100% financed, you need to be really careful in that situation and, think about what your cash flow is going to look like. So, I've had times where we've had 5 or 6 properties that we're working on vacant, and I'm paying mortgages on 5 or 6 properties without any rental income coming in. It'll eat into your cash flow really quick if you're not careful. So definitely something you need to think about. So that goes into cash flow. So, if you have a normal job like I do, you can cover some of those, cover some of that negative cash flow for a while. And a lot of times you're going to have negative cash flow on deals in the short-term period. So, I've bought houses before where they were rented way under where they should have been, and the lease didn't expire for 6 months. And I bought that property knowing that for 6 months this property is going to have some negative cash flow until I can get the rents up to where it needs to be and rehab it. So something you think about. And then the other thing is the investor's needs. So that goes back to the what can you do for the investor, but what does your investor want? So some investors, they might want the monthly cash flow. Some investors, they might want the money in 5 years. You really need to sit down with them and think about, or talk to them about, what do they actually want out of the deal. So a lot of investors don't want the money right now. And the other thing is, so this kind of goes into taxes here, but with private lending, me as a business owner, I can write that interest off, right? It's tax deductible. But that also means that the investor, has to claim that as income on their taxes. In the equity partner situation, basically how that works is as far as taxes go, is whatever their percent ownership is, they can actually, write off things based on their percentage of ownership. So, if I depreciate the property by X amount and their ownership is 20%, there can actually be some pretty significant tax benefits to being an equity partner versus doing private lending for the investor. And anything that they do, related to being a part owner, so maybe they drove out to the site, they can deduct mileage, things like that. So there's definitely some tax benefit there. So taxes is something you need to think about. Timelines, so, how long is this person going to be involved, and then what is the exit strategy is also something you need to think about. So, an equity partner, that could be a pretty long-term relationship, or it could be, maybe a shorter term, but that's something you need to discuss and figure out up front. So, a good strategy is maybe when you're setting all this up, sit down for an equity partner anyway. Sit down and talk to them, figure out how long, when do you want this money back? What is our exit strategy and what is our plan? So maybe it's, I'm going to buy a value add property, I'm going to hold it for 5 years, and then I'm going to sell it off. I'm going to take my part in 1031 exchange into another property, and they'll get their piece, and we go our separate ways. But you really need to think about, how are we going to exit, and how does the investor get paid out of that exit? So another situation that you might have in an equity partner is, maybe the equity partner, you buy out the equity partner, but you keep the property for yourself. So that is something that we've done, or we've structured one of those before, where basically I want a mechanism to where I can end up owning the property myself, still give a good return to the investor, and get them their money back at some period of time. So to handle that, you need to have a mechanism in your operating agreement that explains how to do that. So for example, and it needs to be fair for everybody, right? So for example, how we've handled that is we have a mechanism in our operating agreement, and it says, the mechanism by which we buy this person out is we hire somebody to do a third-party appraisal. So this is somebody that's unbiased. They're going to give you a fair evaluation of what the property is worth. And then we are going to buy out that equity partner's 20, 30, 40% ownership, whatever that is. So if it's a property that's worth, $1 million, and they're a 20% equity partner, and the valuation comes in $1 million, that means to pay them off and buy them out, we need to pay them off $200,000. So if you had enough equity built up in that property to where you can refinance it and get $200,000, you can pay them off, and then you guys own it free, or we would own it free and clear, and then the equity partner gets bought out. They've made their good returns on that property over time, and everybody's happy. So definitely something you need to think about there. So I think that kind of covers the basics here. As always, if you guys have any questions, please leave comments below. I'll try to address them in my next video. And please like and subscribe if this is helpful for you. And I appreciate everybody watching. Thank you.